Hey, have you ever noticed how most podcasts have advertisements at the beginning and the middle and at the end for like mail order underwear or online legal services or some bullshit like that? Have you ever noticed that Nostalgia Trap never bothers you with that? Have you ever noticed that? Do you ever wonder why we don't do that? We have a lot of listeners. Advertisers are always trying to get us to read their ad copy on this program, and I've never done it. And a lot of people have called me stupid for not doing that. They say, David, you could be making a lot of money reading underwear ads on Nostalgia Trap. But the basic reason why I don't do that is I cannot bring myself to bother my listeners with advertisements for bullshit they don't fucking need. So maybe I'm suffering financially as a result of that decision, but that's the decision I've made. So you're welcome, I guess, but the other part of this is I do a lot of work for Nostalgia Trap, and it is a money-making enterprise for me in some ways. And I do have the hope of one day not having to go in and teach bullshit classes at universities and colleges that exploit my labor and give me nothing in return. I would like to be liberated. You know, maybe I never will be. Maybe Nostalgia Trap will never get that big, but that's my hope. So I'm appealing to you, the listeners. If you like this show, if you appreciate the work we put into it, if you can subscribe, now would be a great time because the semester is starting right now. And honestly, my college, without naming what college that is, but my college is asking me to put my life in danger to teach in-person classes right now. I won't go into details, but administration is acting in a way that is deeply, deeply horrifying to me personally and to all the rest of the faculty, the adjuncts, the students. We're not having a good time. So some new subscribers to Nostalgia Trap would be very edifying right now. If you're able to subscribe, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Join our little community. We've got tons of bonus material and a bunch of really exciting series with Justin Rogers Cooper coming this fall. If you're not able to subscribe to Nostalgia Trap, no hard feelings. We're all getting through this bullshit together, but I appreciate all the people who are supporting the show. Thanks so much, and enjoy this episode. All right, Nostalgia Trappers, welcome to the program. I am your host, David Parsons. I hope you're doing well. I hope you are navigating our rapidly disintegrating global situation with as much health and humor as you possibly can. And I hope you enjoy the conversation I have to share with you today. My guest is Jenni Olson. She's someone whose work I came to awareness of by just flipping through the Criterion Channel. If you're a subscriber of Criterion Channel, and I'm not like asking you to do that, but if you are, you can watch her two films, The Joy of Life, which came out in 2005, and The Royal Road, which came out in 2015. And you can also find them for free on sites like Tubi, tubi.com, or Mubi, mubi.com. So find these films because they're just extraordinary. And the first one I watched was The Royal Road. And by the way, Jenni Olson, you know, as we discover in this conversation, is a historian and an archivist and a writer, someone who has been working in the world of LGBTQ film and culture and politics for her whole adult life. And she tells a little bit of that story here. But I'm totally enraptured, honestly, by her movies. Her two feature-length urban landscape essay films. And we'd get into a lot of the thoughts and ideas behind the very particular structure and form that these films take, which are, again, urban landscape films in which there's a voiceover. They're essays, and they're reflecting on things like suicides from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, or the history of Spanish colonialism and the settlement of California, mixed in with all these personal reflections on queer love and desire. There is so much going on in these films, and I will say they're not for everyone, but for me, they are just perfect specimens of how to engage with history and how to do that in a way that's fresh and that's personal and it feels really alive. So I honestly cannot say enough about her work, and it was really just such an honor to be able to talk with her about why she makes these movies the way she does. But also, her work is part of a much larger sort of landscape of what we might call, independent cinema, experimental cinema, and queer cinema. So if you're interested in more of that stuff, we did an episode a couple weeks ago with our good friend Donald Borenstein. If you are a subscriber to Nostalgia Trap, you can go check that episode out. It's episode 281. It's called At a New Life, We Took Aim with Donald Borenstein, I believe it's actually pronounced. But either way, go check out that episode. And if you want to do that, you can do it at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And I'll have that episode linked in this description. But I hope you enjoy this conversation because, again, Jenni Olson is someone whose work you ought to know. So here is my conversation with historian and filmmaker Jenni Olson. Okay, Jenni Olson, I spent last night watching two of your films, The Royal Road and The Joy of Life, and I was just telling you before we started recording here that it feels like I know you because the films communicate such an intimacy, and I think that maybe that was what you were aiming for. But I don't know you. It's great to meet you and great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, David. Thank you for having me. Great to meet you. And excited to dig in on all of this. And the first thing I want to say is like, well, you don't know me, and that, but particularly because it's a funny thing. I mean, my films are very intimate and very focused on, this kind of intimate storytelling. And one of the questions that I often get in like Q&As after screenings is, how autobiographical is this? Or, and I do actually have a line at the beginning of The Royal Road. I say this thing where I say, I grew up, I don't know, something about pretending to be a fictional character. Mm-hmm. And then and then to me, it feels like, okay, I just said I'm pretending to be a fictional character, and now I can say anything.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, like now I can be really vulnerable. And there is a lot of very intimate, kind of vulnerable stuff in my work. And I'm, I'm like, okay, yes, that's drawn from my experience, or it's kind of quote unquote me in a way. Mm-hmm. But then in other ways, I'm like, no, that's not me, or like that's totally made up. And a lot of it is, whatever, made up.
Yeah, and there's
the personal aspects, and then just to say, there's these like really personal, and intimate things about being queer and butch and pining over unavailable women, and this very first person intimate stuff mixed in with these things that are like such dry, arcane, historical, factual, quote unquote, things of like the history of the Spanish colonization of California in The Royal Road, and
well, that's what caught my attention actually. Is looking through how I found your work is through Criterion Channel, and I saw the description for The Royal Road, and realized that it was about Camino Real, and I'm born and raised in Ventura, California. I made a model of the Ventura mission when I was in fifth grade, and it's like something every California kid apparently still does, which is incredible. But that's what drew me to actually press play for the first time watching your film and not realizing what everything it was going to encompass and how you were going to mix that history with this sort of personal story. The form of your films are very particular. And when I watched The Joy of Life and went back and then wanted to watch your previous feature-length film, which is in 2005, it's a similar sort of style. Can you talk a little bit about how that style developed? Because I find it really compelling. I can't help telling you that I'm a fan of your work.
Thank you. I'm so glad. And it is a very, odd way of making films. And I mean, one of the best things that anyone ever said to me about the joy of life was, I've never seen anything like it. Yeah, I mean, I shoot on 16 millimeter film, and I shoot, but specifically, I shoot 4:3 aspect ratio, which is not necessarily something that people necessarily consciously notice, but it's the square aspect ratio as opposed to a wide aspect ratio. And there are all these things about my work that have I don't know, it's like almost not literally nostalgia, but you know things that are connected to the analog or to history or to oldness.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so I shoot on 16 millimeter film, which in and of itself is old and weird and crazy, but has like all these qualities that are really very organic to what I'm trying to do in all aspects of the craft and the storytelling.
Mm.
And I shoot these, very mundane urban landscapes, and with ambient, street sounds or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's
Mm-hmm.
like, here we are in downtown San Francisco or in the Mission District or uh, in LA here's empty alleys and brick buildings um, and and shooting early in the morning. So there are no people around you notice the light and the shadows and the way the wind is blowing and that it's still and empty and I mean, even just describing it, I have feelings and
Yeah.
I have and to me, I don't know, it's such a simple thing, but and I think even more, as in our crazy world, like it's so difficult for us to just pause and slow down and be present
Mm.
and there is this way that my work kind of forces people to pause.
Yeah, there's a
And
mesmerizing quality to the work, and you're right. It does recreate the feeling of standing on a street corner in the morning when no one's around, and there is a sort of forced contemplation there. I went to UC Santa Barbara Film Studies Department in the '90s, so 16 millimeter was sort of like it was like the last gasp of the 16 millimeter student film world because everyone was moving to digital at that time, and there was real it's funny because it's like I really identify like the generation like Gen X, I guess, and older millennials with like living through this half analog, half more digital world. And it seems like your work is somewhat calling to that. It's like calling attention to that, right? Like the nostalgia is directed in some way towards a different kind of life, almost a different pace of life.
yes, very much so. And I mean, and I have like in the work itself and underneath the work a lot of engagement with ideas of the redemption of nostalgia, and like not as the kind of nostalgia that we think of like, oh, I wish things were like they used to be, or like wasn't it great when blah blah blah. It's not meant to be literally that. It's more, I like this idea of the redemption of nostalgia and the lost wisdom.
Mm.
And as we have like continue to hurl forward into technology and like all of the craziness of our lives, that we're losing something, we've
Mm.
forgotten something,
Mm.
and like just something very fundamental about and to me, which is about the analog, and which is about we do actually physically exist in a physical world.
Right.
And we do forget that. We do get all so like lost in our devices and digital this and that, and you know Yeah.
There's
So
something.
it's very spiritual for me.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many strands that come together for me too, and to me, I can't separate it. I'm sure you can't either, from just the idea of like of queer film and a queer sort of way of looking, because it seems like what that, with that analog sort of bodily, sort of bringing it back to, there's something, I don't know if I can be articulate about it, but I feel like your films connect that idea, even though, and this is a really conscious decision, it seems, on your part. There aren't people in your movies, really. You see glimpses of people every once in a while from a distance, maybe in a car, maybe. But
Yeah.
what is that turn about?
Yeah, no, there's very, very conscious, intentional uh, exclusion of any people.
Right.
And I mean, part of it from a craft, from a storytelling perspective. So yeah, visually you're seeing these landscapes, and then on the soundtrack you're hearing, the ambient of the city, very quiet ambient,
Hmm.
like, oh,
Hmm.
little
Yeah.
variations
Oh
on
yeah.
just a little hush of the street, and then quiet, and then me talking.
Hmm.
And I write scripts that are very, like I was saying, like this combination of very intimate, um, vulnerability. I'm all about vulnerability
Hmm.
and sincerity,
Mm.
and um, uh, and hopefully a little bit of humor too. But
Hmm.
and this combination of pining over unavailable women, like I said, which
Hmm.
is also a little funny. But and then this kind of geeky, storytelling about history, and um, but as you're seeing, like, oh, here's this, empty alley, a shot of an empty alley for like 2 minute shot, and here's, me blabbing on the soundtrack. Um, the point is that I need you as the audience to be listening to me, and like really deeply taking it in. And I found that if there were human figures in the shots, your eye is just naturally drawn to that human figure,
Yeah.
and you're like, well, what are they doing? What's going on over there? And then you're not listening to my voiceover. And so it had to be that the shots are, yeah, that there's no people. And I also like the idea that it's not a literal thing, but there's a way that you feel as you're watching, that you are alone in this
Yeah.
city, that
Yeah.
there's like a loneliness, a melancholy, um, and also a joy. And like, the joy of life, my first feature,
Hmm.
um, the title is meant to be, really quite sincere. Like, it really is about the joy of life, and that it's the simple things that are the joy of life, and that, like, going, like, we're alive, like, look at the light, look at the city,
Hmm.
look at, um uh and anyway, yeah.
Yeah, both of your films spend a lot of time in San Francisco, obviously. And the urban landscapes are, to me, I was thinking about San Francisco a lot as a sort of entity while I'm watching this. And even, you've got that great quote from Lawrence Ferlinghetti about the fog. And living in Ventura, we're a coastal city. The fog is a fact of life here. I mean, we've been in fog all summer here. But I wondered what San Francisco, what role it plays in your imagination, and how it fits into this story, because it seems like a story that a part of a story you're telling is kind of the larger story of gay people in Hollywood, and like the history, that you kind of click onto the celluloid closet very early on, but you've taken it into a different direction. It seems like you're kind of playing with vertigo and playing with that history there. But San Francisco is different from LA, and I feel like you sort of like are contemplating these two cities. But I wonder what San Francisco means to you, as a place and as a part of that history.
Yeah. Um, I mean, there's so many aspects of answers to that. I mean, I've been living in San Francisco since 1991. I'm
Mm.
from St. Paul,
Hmm.
Minnesota, and and I mean, I like the idea that, San Francisco as a concept, there are, is this sense of, I mean, similar to Hollywood, of like, the Boulevard of Broken Dreams, I say
Right.
in
Right.
of like, that these are these places that people come to, and to, find themselves, or be, do great things, or whatever, or
Hmm.
not, or
Hmm.
yeah, or have their dreams smashed. And, or, just what the kind of mythological qualities of both cities, both, LA and San Francisco. And anyway, yeah. But San Francisco in particular, I always say living in San Francisco is like living on the set of Vertigo.
Right.
um,
Right.
and and because everywhere you turn, you're like, oh my god, that's a shot from Vertigo. And like, that's where Jimmy Stewart was driving around. And um,
Why is that? Why is that movie such a key text? For you personally, and like I feel like it comes up everywhere. I mean, every time I watch it, I'm like, it's just one of the most disturbing films I've ever seen. But Hitchcock comes up a lot, and in fact, I think you quote Hitchcock in the final line of The Royal Road. You say that, like Hitchcock, you're looking
yeah.
for, love and loss, and I love that ending. But it seems like Hitchcock and Vertigo are important to you.
Yeah, I mean, specifically Vertigo,
Yeah.
and like, I mean, I think Vertigo. I'm not. I mean, it's funny. I think about it, and I'm not actually particularly that much of a fan of Hitchcock per se.
Mm-hmm.
It's that I'm a fan of Vertigo, and that I think Vertigo is just this uniquely rich text, like in so many ways, and and uniquely rich because it's so much about San Francisco, or San Francisco is so key to it, but also that, that it is a film about love and loss,
Mm.
and about desire, and pining over unavailable women. Is the funny thing. Actually, someone in a Q&A pointed this out to me, and I was like, what? Was like, oh, in the same way that, like Vertigo is, Jimmy Stewart pining over pursuing two unavailable women. That's what The Royal Road is, because The Royal Road also has this, like, there are like two, unavailable women
Mm-hmm.
who I'm pining over. And
Mm-hmm.
like, so there's all these layers where it's like, I really am Jimmy Stewart. And um and but anyway, so yeah, San Francisco is a kind of muse to me, and as is Vertigo. And I when I first moved here to work for Frameline, the organization that produces the San Francisco LGBT Film Festival, I moved here to be the co-director of the festival. And our office was literally across the street from Mission Dolores. And so, I would look out my office window every day for a year, the first year here, being like, oh, that's where Kim Novak gets out of her Jaguar to go into the cemetery. And then Jimmy Stewart follows her into the cemetery, and blah, blah, blah. And
Mm.
I also, I don't know, just on the Vertigo thing, I really love, as a writer, as a storyteller, the idea that you can, I don't know, it's like you can connect to deeper truths, or be able to talk about more vulnerable things by approaching them indirectly through other texts.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that's also, I'm like, I don't know, maybe that's my, dysfunctional self, that I grew up watching movies and being like, oh, this is how I'm gonna understand myself, through fictional characters.
Yeah.
Like, going like, oh, that's how you're supposed to do that? Like, that's how people behave. um but anyway. And, and then I don't know, it's interesting, like the queer aspect, because, you whatever, if you come to my films, it's funny. Many people come to my films thinking, like, oh, it's going to be a documentary about the history of the Spanish colonization of California, and then they're like,
it is though. It is.
but but like it opens with like blah blah blah. She's so cute. She won't sleep with me. This kind of like, and people are like, what?
Yeah. Because I mean, this is part of what we talk about a lot on this program, is like making history documentaries, and like Ken Burns and PBS and a certain kind of boring style. Nothing against Ken Burns. Well, I have a lot of issues with Ken Burns, but that's another episode. But you know what I'm talking about. There's a certain set of expectations when you say like historical documentary to people. Most people aren't going to be too interested in that, or they're going to have a certain set of expectations. And that's why I love your films, because they are historical documentaries in some way. Like there's an element of it that exists as that. But for me, like all those experimental elements that you throw into that historical mix are what make the film special, or what make them compelling, and what make actually the history of like, Spanish colonization in California actually means something to me, is because it's packaged within this sort of story of a modern queer person talking about love in San Francisco. Like that, to me, that works. I hope there's a bigger and bigger audience for those sorts of intersections, because that historical documentary genre is pretty stale. I don't know if you agree with that, but.
Well, thank you. You summarized my feelings about so much of it. I had this really interesting experience when the Royal Road played at the Napa International Film Festival, and there were 2 screenings. And the first screening, people showed up, and I looked at the audience, and I was like, okay, there's like a ton, like mostly like older straight white men, like I could, like older guys, and I thought, oh my god, these guys, and or like straight couples too, like husband and wife, and
history buffs maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, like, oh my god, they're like thinking that it's going to be a regular film. And I did my intro, and the film started, and sure enough, like 15 minutes in, half the audience walked out.
Wow.
And wow. This is actually something that I was used to with The Joy of Life. Like, The Joy of Life was even more so, because, as you know, The Joy of Life is Butch Dyke pining over unavailable women and the history of suicide and the Golden Gate Bridge. And so similarly, people showed up thinking it's going to be a documentary about suicide and the history of suicide and Golden Gate Bridge. And then they're like, what the fuck is this? Like, it's like, what? This is crazy. This like Butch Dyke talking about like, fisting.
Like, yep, I noticed that.
and like they were just like, wow, on top of being like, what the hell is this? Like, a 3-minute shot of a brick building, and
or a bodega,
but so the screenings at Napa, so that first screening, like, half the audience walked out, and I was like, aha, I knew that was going to happen. And then for the second screening, I went up and I did the intro, and I said, I was like, so I see you guys, and I'm gonna say this, like, I imagine that you're here thinking that this is going to be a conventional documentary about the history of the Spanish colonization of California. And I want to tell you, that's in there. And you might, in the first bit of it, you might be watching and thinking, this isn't what I came for. It's not what I'm expecting. I'm going to tell you, I hope you can, kind of just open up and just take it for what it is. And I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy it in a really unexpected way. And I'm asking you to trust me with that. And like, I whatever. I just want to set it up for you.
Yeah.
And like, sure enough, they all stayed. And it was like these, like, older straight guys. And they were like, they loved it. And
Good.
I mean, really loved it,
Yeah.
and including the parts where I'm like, oh,
Pining
and,
over women
and yeah. And I
and
thought,
being very gay and all of it, and there's a bit of like graphic sexuality to it. I mean, to me, it's like those are the elements that make it. Those are the elements that really connected. And can you talk a little bit? I mean, I know I like hate to be the person that's like, what do your films mean? But your films do have a certain kind of very particular aesthetic to them. But what is that connection for you between the like, telling the story of colonization or talking about the history of suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge, which is an incredible history, by the way. I knew a little bit about that, but not all of it. Why do that? Why connect those two strands, that deeply personal connection, and then this sort of a history of a particular element of California?
um, I know, yeah. Good
You're
question.
like, I don't know.
Well, when I was doing the kind of festival circuit with the Joy of Life, and I got questioned a lot of like, I don't get it. What's the connection? Why are
Mm,
these two things together? And my like somewhat, passive aggressive answer was like, it's my movie, and these are the things that I'm interested in,
yeah.
and um, I just get to do that. And but in a sincere way, like, I think, well, these are the things that I'm interested in. And I like the idea of first person storytelling.
Yeah.
And even though I do actually think of myself as like half as a character, there are times in my films where I'm like, yeah, that's not really me. That's kind of my persona,
Hmm.
like a
Hmm.
persona, like a songwriter or a poet.
Hmm.
Um, and then there are times where I drop into, I'm like, okay, that's me. That's me talking,
Hmm.
really me. Like, um, and but that, what I'm trying to achieve on the highest level is, uh, you know, a, a a vulnerability and an authenticity, and something that makes the viewer, can honestly, that causes the viewer to connect with their own feelings.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
a lot of that is to have the courage to say things that we don't necessarily say, like, oh, I'm insecure.
Hmm.
um, or in terms of the personal, as whatever chunks or aspects of my work. And then, but then also that, like, some of the things that I get most excited about in a kind of, I don't know, geeky way, are these historical topics, and like trying to understand that. And particularly, I mean, it's kind of odd to say like my films are also social justice films, and that they're not like necessarily meant to be, but they are.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
is like what, the Mexican American War, like, let's look at a map and be like, wow, we took
Mm.
that land from Mexico, the entire American Southwest, California, blah blah blah. It belonged to Mexico.
That
And we
sequence is
took
great,
it.
by the way. I mean, I'm like, this is a sequence I want to use in my classes just for that portion of American history, because yeah, we spend a lot of time with a map of the United States, and kind of understanding the contest for the West, and how it ends up in the hands of the United States is so insanely
Well,
dirty. Yeah.
yeah, well, and you brought up like the California state public school curriculum, that every kid since, the, I don't know how long, the 1950s at
Yeah.
least, it's like, okay, you're in fifth grade, you build a mission. And we talk about what the point of it is we talk about the heroic missionaries who, conquered the state. And I mean, in the I think it was kind of in the 70s and 80s that started to shift, that there was more of a like, okay, let's talk about what happened to the indigenous people who, were all wiped out and enslaved, and that it wasn't just this
Yeah.
heroic narrative. And yeah, it's still, as you pointed out, and my kids both had to build missions. And when I was making the railroad, my younger kid was in fourth or fifth grade and was like doing the mission thing. And like, of course, what they come away with is they're like kind of told this thing about like, oh yeah, and the native people, it was not good for them. But it still is this emphasis on like, but look, these like buildings were made, and like that the missionaries really were these heroes. And anyway, but I trying to like, kind of distill and crystallize, like, it's interesting actually right now to think of it in the context of the whole critical race theory thing,
Right.
of like, like
our father Sarah statue, we took it down just like last year. Yeah.
Right. The statue of Junipero Sarah in Golden Gate Park, which is in my film,
Yep.
prominently, got taken down, whatever, 2 summers ago, whatever, pulled down by, radical activists. And, but those kinds of, all of that mythology, to be able to step back and be like, oh my God, like this has been this mythology. These are mythologies that we have, I guess, understandably perpetuated. But like to be like, let's open our eyes, look at the fucking map, and like look at the history, particularly the Mexican-American War history. Just like, it just drove me nuts. That was the other thing, actually. My older kid, during the time I was making this, was in, I think it's in 10th grade, where they the curriculum is like, okay, now we're going to do the Mexican-American War for about 5 minutes because we have to get to the Civil War,
right,
which takes up, a lot of the curriculum, understandably, really important, but like they skip over the Mexican-American War. And like, it is the tendency in, like you ask someone like, what was the Mexican-American War? And most people picture our current borders and think like, I don't know, I guess we fought with them. I guess we had some kind of a war with them. Not as opposed to like, oh, I guess like we, a third of our country belonged to them.
Yeah, right.
And like, or
and
whatever.
The 49ers thing you bring up is amazing, because it's like, it's very recognizable to me that most Californians would be able to say, oh, the 49ers, that's the name of the football team. And that's the year that the gold rush happened and all these people came and found gold. And you point out in your film, well, what happened just a year before in 1848, right? That's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's why all these white people are showing up to get the gold, because it's now the United States, which just stole all this land. Yeah, it's weird because I grew up with that history and building missions too, and going to missions. I mean, I think I wrote to you, I'd just been to Solvang, crowded with tourists taking pictures of the mission there. Really beautiful landscape, etc. But I'm thinking like, what this represented during the time when it was an active mission is so insane. I mean, it's an institution of genocide. And it's just still in 2021, this very woke social justice kind of culture. It's still here, and it's still like sort of a part of California's landscape. And that's an odd thing to me.
Well, yeah. And I do, I kind of reflect on that too. And that, I mean, I don't know, how, whatever these kind of multiple aspects of how we do want to like have a nostalgic attachment to stories of the past, and including stories of the past where we think we were heroes, or things were good,
right?
And like, it's understandable that we want that. But
well, you've got a great piece that sort of within the Royal Road called "In Defense of Nostalgia,"
Mm.
which I had to bring up because this podcast is called Nostalgia Trap, and we talk about sort of the hazards of nostalgia, but especially the kind of nostalgia you talked about earlier, that sort of like always thinking about the past as when it was better, and that's that. Whereas your definition of nostalgia is a little bit different. I just wanted to quote you. I thought it was so great. You said, nostalgia is a strategy for staying connected to the analog world in which we live by reconnecting us to our humanity. I believe that nostalgia could be the very thing that saves us. And I thought it's such an antithesis to what we always talk about here. But at the same time, you're saying something about sort of, I don't know, the importance of history and how and not just like the history of like what we're, Spanish colonization, but the importance of personal histories and how those weigh on us. I don't know. There was something very striking about that thought to me.
Of course, I love that you picked up on that, and I'm very proud of that line. By reconnecting us to our humanity, I believe nostalgia could be the very thing that saves us. And I think when I first wrote it, I was like, that's bullshit. Like what? Like that's like sounds like so pretentious and I don't believe that. And then I was like, actually, I do believe that. And I believe it in the sense that, again, like nostalgia in this way that is about reconnecting us to our humanity. That is like, and I don't know, in certain ways, like it's all, I'm like, God, I'm like so cheesy. Like, I mean, I'm
Mm.
like so sincere of like, um, even just the like thing about being in the landscape is like when we were little kids and was like, you'd be like, wow, an airplane flew overhead. And I
Mm.
like was like, wow, there's an airplane flying overhead. And like I'm here and I'm noticing it
Mm.
and I'm alive and I'm um and like in some way, I mean, I think like, and now I'm in this like chaos of our digital world, but also like now I'm like, old and have responsibilities.
Yeah, right. I was
I'm
thinking,
like,
is nostalgia always? There is a child. There is a connection to youth with it, right?
yeah,
It seems because what I was thinking when I was very nostalgic for my own youth of being in a city and being like single in a city and like dating people and being heartbroken and that kind of experience of being. I feel like people in their 20s off and 30s maybe have those experiences the most. But it did pop up a nostalgia for me of that, like that relationship to the city and that relationship to myself, which does feel like, I don't know, people tend to get, feel like people tend to idealize that time in their lives as like the most alive time for whatever reason.
yeah. Well, no, and it's obviously there's a lot too about like being in these modes of desire and like
Right.
fucking and like
Yeah.
can I say that this
You
is
can
just a
say all of
podcast?
that. Yeah.
We're
No,
not,
but that's
yeah.
exactly what
And
your film brought up for me is thinking about, oh, my own experiences with this and feeling vibrant and alive and what that meant, especially discovering a city when you're young,
yeah,
is something different. Yeah.
and some of that, so yeah, some of that is like literally personal, like you're pointing out is like, yeah, that was before I had a mortgage and children and was like, oh, I'm getting old and like worrying and stressed out and was just like, wow, here I am in this big city and like all these cute girls and like, oh my God, let's get together. And the whatever the vulnerability of all of that. And but the nostalgia, but anyway, but I it's the humanity piece or the like, yeah, again, like the vulnerability piece. And that it isn't literally like, oh, I mean, God, I do not wish that I was 20 again, or
No,
in my
that's what's
in
interesting
my
about it too. Yeah, I do not. Those
and
were when I really think about the day to day life. It was so chaotic and so uncertain, and I felt so unsure of myself. And part of like getting older, what you're describing as responsibility feels like it's really about you're describing like sort of becoming more comfortable with yourself. Yeah.
yeah, but it's about um yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the emotional connectedness of
Mm.
of the quote unquote nostalgia. I mean, I also have this other thing in the railroad where I do this little argument with Tony Kushner.
Yes.
And that
I love that.
I had heard him give this lecture in 1998 on it's got this really great title, which I'm now I can't remember, but and he had this whole thing, basically a critique of nostalgia, and I was like, I mean, the whole lecture is incredible. I mean, he's so amazing, and but I was very struck by this stuff that he says, this critique of nostalgia, and then I asked him if I could use the excerpt of the lecture and then basically kind of be arguing with him, and I have this thing where I say, like, yeah, I heard his lecture and now he's made me feel guilty about my nostalgia, but yeah.
It's a dialectical thing. I think that's part of what he's talking about, right? It seems like that's a word that Kushner invokes a lot. Nostalgia. I think that's why I like the idea of nostalgia trap, just because it's like a hall of mirrors. Nostalgia. It's like the draw of it is so powerful, and it has such a grip on the wider culture in like both, I don't know, productive ways and unproductive ways, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think that's why I'm always trying to redeem my version, which is to say that it isn't about escaping into the past or, well, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's like, you know what? I need a break. I'm going to go watch an episode of My So-Called Life.
Oh, that's very recognizable. I mean, I think I read in an interview you said that your films are an attempt to stop time, and I felt like that really was recognizable to me too. Watching your films, that I felt, oh, I'm kind of pausing here on a street corner, and I'm going to sort of, I don't know, take stock in a way that most films don't ask me to do, because I'm sort of like involved in a narrative that's pushing me forward very quickly.
Yes, that's actually a line in the railroad, and I always forget what it is. It's a really great line where I say like something about like my, impossible, my almost impossible and yet partially successful effort to stop time.
Yes.
Which is to say, like, I have now captured, and then I say, I've now captured these images on film, and that in itself has stopped time.
Yeah.
Which, it does kind of convey this mixture of things about nostalgia and it is, again, I said earlier, that I do think of my work as very spiritual, and that it is like grappling with these incredibly profound things.
Yeah.
And but also I hope in a also in a funny way. And like a lot of the persona of my, like, pining over unavailable women thing is both sincere of like, like real emotion, and then but also like a little bit funny, like, okay, I can see that I'm being ridiculous, or that I'm being melodramatic, or and like, here I go again.
I think it's a gift to the viewer in a lot of ways, because as you're sort of contemplating this material about history and the landscape, you're also, you have this voice that sort of draws you in with a level of interest from a different angle. The quote you have at the beginning of I think it's the beginning of the Royal Road, is about voiceover, right? It's about like voiceover, and I'd never really thought about it in quite that way. But this sort of like disembodied voice, it's really important. You have it, and I think the quote says something about that being a special being, like a special kind of being. But there's something really profound about that, and I'll be thinking about it a lot as I watch other films with voiceovers, particularly when the voiceover is not a character that's in the film, but just a voice. And you use your voice is the Royal Road, but it's someone else's voice in The Joy of Life, right?
Yes, my friend Harry Dodge, who is so amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, his work in The Joy of Life. Yeah, he's an old friend, and he's funny. He did The Joy of Life before he transitioned.
Mm-hmm.
And when I asked him to do The Royal Road, he was like, "Oh, my voice is too deep now." um, and I was like, "No, that's okay. I don't mind. You did such a great job in The Joy of the Life." And he was like, "No, just do it yourself." And which I'm glad I did. And
Mm-hmm.
um, but but yes,
The voice, yeah, the voiceover thing seems like it's a key part of what watching it. It's the film essay is a very particular genre. There are not a lot of people that do film essays. I feel like, and yet, like whenever I see them, I'm always drawn to them,
Mhm.
um, because of exactly the qualities that you're registering there.
Yes. I mean, it's a very, yeah, a little tiny subgenre.
How did you come to it? I know we don't have a lot of time here, but I know you're a film studies person, and like you studied film studies as an undergrad, right? Is that was
Yeah, yeah,
how
yeah.
I I told you I went to UCSB film studies. I was the first couple years of college. I was like a political science major. Thought I was going to be a lawyer. When I found the film studies department, it was like that was when college came alive to me. That's when things became meaningful to me at all. Film was where I really found like my community and what I wanted to study. I wondered what your experience was because it seems like film studies was similar to in the sense that there's a direction in your life that like sort of drew you into cinema as a sort of mode of expression.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I was at the University of Minnesota, and I took film studies, and it was actually my intro to film professor gave me a copy of Vito Russo's book, The Celluloid Closet. And I think he sensed that it would be meaningful to me. I was not out, or I was really struggling. And like,
Wow. Mm,
and I read that book and was like, "Oh, I'm queer."
mm,
Wow.
mm-hmm.
And it was how I came out, and it was, this great connection that was about film. Um, and that was how I kind of embarked on my career as a film programmer and a film critic and a film writer and then film historian. And
Mm-hmm.
I have, all these other hats, and then eventually a filmmaker. And um, but what was I gonna say? Film studies was something I was gonna say.
Well, I mean, I can ask a question that
Yeah.
that I was thinking about because I mean, Celluloid Closet it became a documentary, right? That was really well known in the 90s. I feel like everybody saw that. And it was really influential when I watched it in just teaching me a history that I didn't know at all, which was that this sort of not only the history of gay people in Hollywood, but also this sort of like idea of watching Hollywood films and like sort of seeing subtexts and like identifying with characters in subverted ways and all that sort of thing. You kind of hint at that a little bit in your movie where you talk about sort of like taking on masculinity and looking at Hollywood movies as your mode of masculinity. But I thought was interesting, and I thought this is maybe the film studies thing from you, and I'm just guessing. I wonder if this is recognizable to you, but sort of like you sort of come to it through Hollywood. But you end up making experimental films. Like your films are sort of like an avant-garde sort of take on
Right.
this stuff. I wonder what like how did you get to the experimental stuff? Because it seems like like you, I was drawn into movies from a young age, watching mostly Hollywood.
Right. Right. Yeah, and like, if I'm, given a choice of what I want to watch, I turn on the Criterion channel and watch old movies, and
Yeah, me too.
classic Hollywood in particular.
Yeah.
And but but yeah, when I thought about making movies, I mean, the most kind of influential films to me as a filmmaker, the first thing I remember seeing, thinking like, "Oh, I could make a film," was Ross McElroy's Sherman's March
Yeah.
from
Mm-hmm.
1986.
Yep.
and which is him wandering around the South, theoretically making a documentary about Sherman's march through the South, but really, this kind of first person reflection on his neurotic, unsuccessful pursuit of women.
Yeah.
And, that it's this kind of odd, yeah.
That makes so much sense that you appreciated that film. Yeah.
Yeah. And that it's this kind of essay film that, has similar to The Royal Road, these kind of odd combination of elements. And then a film called Massillon from 1991 by William E. Jones, about growing up gay in Massillon, Ohio. And Bill studied at Cal Arts with James Benning, who is kind of like the king of landscape films, and does these like I've actually only seen one of his films, El Valley Centro, which is like a series of, I want to say, 25 3-minute shots of the Central Valley in California. And
love that.
Yeah. And I mean, he's, there are certain, like, people think about experimental film, or when I describe my film as like a urban landscape essay film, people are like, oh God, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
And like a lot of work to watch. And I like to say my films are kinder, gentler experimental films. And I think they're like extremely accessible and like very emotionally present in this way, and like even funny. And
I agree. I want to say that for listeners, because I think a lot of landscape film, you might be like, I'm going to be bored out of my mind, but I find your films very rewatchable. Actually, they remind me of Tom. Is it Tom Anderson's films, like Los Angeles Plays Itself? It's sort of like there's this mesmerizing quality of watching. And taking the time, but also the voiceover is so critical, and there is so much humor and so much sort of like, I'm always surprised by what you're saying and what you're going to say next, because I don't know if it's going to have to do with colonization, or you're going to be talking about fisting. Like, there's going to be so many different like elements to it that it isn't just I'm just watching paint dry type of movie at all. To me, I wish more people were watching movies like this, because I think there's such a, I don't know, there's something vital you're communicating there that I don't really pick up on in a lot of movies. I do want to ask you though about how things have changed, just in terms of gay people in visibility in Hollywood and in cinema and in culture has changed dramatically just in my lifetime since the 90s. I mean, the example I have is like I taught a class on the history of like Sunset Boulevard and history of Hollywood and things like that. But we watched and politics at Emerson College in LA. And it was all, this was just a couple years ago. All the kids were 18 to 20 years old, and we watched How to Survive a Plague, the documentary about AIDS and ACT UP. And no one had seen it. Many of the students were gay in the class. They were all completely shocked by this history, and were mainly shocked, honestly, not by the AIDS material, which was harrowing and insane, but just how homophobia was so normalized in the wider culture, and how you had like watching the clips of politicians saying things just absolutely shocked them, because so many of these kids had grown up. I say kids, they're young people. They grew up watching Glee. They grew up like in a culture that was very like, at least for many of them, very like welcoming into like a kind of gay pop culture. I wonder how that's changed and what that means to you, because it's something that you've been sort of at the center of in curating all these film festivals, and it's almost like that change has been a part of your history as well. It's really interesting to me. There's a push and pull there. It's a dialectic for sure.
Yeah. Well, no, thanks for how you framed that, and and it is something that actually I just got to write a piece for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Queer Cinema, which is kind of cool, which I think will be out by the end of this year. I got to write a piece on the last 30 years of queer cinema,
Mhm.
and kind of combination of, actually, it's funny, it's very similar to my film work in a way, because it's a combination of like the actual history of that and my own personal history in relation to that, which
Yeah.
is, I feel so blessed in my career that like I have been part of that, and that like when I started at the San Francisco LGBT Film Festival was right at the beginning of the new queer cinema. And, one of the first year I was there was like, we showed The Living End and Swoon and The Hours and the Times, and had like all this attention of like, wow, it's the new queer cinema, and like the mainstream cares and is like, oh, this is an important movement in cinema. And it was whatever. It's always, there are always beginnings of social change. And, obviously it's 1969, Stonewall, 1991, the new queer cinema, whatever.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
but as referencing How to Survive a Plague, like that was, ACT UP, whatever, around that time. There's so many great films about ACT UP and
Yeah.
that period of time, and what a crucial time that was. But in terms of, kind of representation in film and popular culture, it's incredible to think of that time of like, before Ellen came out, before,
Right.
and before there were like TV shows, and like it's just so many things where you're just like, oh my God, like every TV show is so gay. Like,
Right.
and
Right.
um and how powerful that is, and big movies, and it's really powerful for both, LGBT people growing up and coming of age and seeing themselves on screen. And that's been so much of my career has been about, as a writer and film historian and programmer and everything, and filmmaker, just how important it is for us to see ourselves on screen,
Mm.
and that it makes us feel less alone. It makes us, helps us understand one another. It helps us come together in
Mhm.
community, to, see our commonalities. And, we do still live in a deeply homophobic
Mhm.
society, and particularly transphobic society.
Mhm.
And like in this moment, trans folks are just absolutely under attack, in the crosshairs of the, not just the extreme right wing, but just plain old Republicans, of this, wedge issue
Mhm.
of the worst, stoking the worst fears, and anyway, perpetuating, actual violence against trans folks. And, but it's particularly intense that, that is the lived reality. And there's like 100 bills in state legislatures across the country right now that are anti-trans, real things happening.
Mhm.
And at the same time that we have, Pose on TV, and
Right.
this,
Right.
black trans women writing and starring, and you know, like, wow, it's amazing. And I mean, of course, one is like, well, it's a backlash, and we're in the middle
Mm.
of
Mhm.
this in all these ways around, you know, the amazing moment of, consciousness that was raised last summer in the
Yeah.
aftermath of George Floyd. And,
Mhm.
that there was like just a minute there where it felt like, wow, white people really are understanding this. I am understanding this
Mm.
in a deeper way.
Mhm.
My privilege is, you know, this huge problem.
Yeah, right,
that I just
right.
am like,
And it's similar too. It seems like it's similar in the sense of like you have a culture that's very that's very like black friendly, and that you have black faces as heroes in movies and in TV shows and athletes, etc. And then this sort of like social reality that totally contradicts that. It seems like that parallels a lot of what's happened with gay culture and gay visibility, is that there's a social reality that's still there. Yeah.
It's a very similar thing that, that there are these tensions, and that, it is just the fact that, historically marginalized folks are under attack, and, in this kind of crosshairs of, particularly the right, and again, mainstream Republicans, and just like opportunists who are being horrible and appealing to people's worst fears, and rather than taking genuine leadership to appeal to people's best selves. And
imagine that.
And I hope this will be like my grand pretentious ending, as like, I hope that I do that in my work, is appeal to people's best selves, and that that we should be, in our own vulnerabilities, and trying to understand ourselves, and and trying to understand, the world, the histories of the world, of our world, and of the implications of these things. And I don't know, then that sounds like too educational, or too like
well, I told you, I'm a history teacher, and like one of the things that I think about a lot is how to teach history, and I will 100% be showing your films in my classes when thinking about these subjects, particularly the Royal Road, because we do think about the history of imperialism in my classes, and because I want to interrogate. That's part of what I think about a lot, is sort of like how the form of telling history hasn't really been that effective for us, and so like the experimentation with form I really, really appreciate, and that's why I wanted to speak with you, because I think you are sort of in your films and in all of your work confronting these histories in really unique ways, and I think that's what's sort of vital about it. So that's my pretentious comment about your about your work. But thank you, Jenni Olson. I really appreciate speaking with you.
Thanks, David. I really appreciate it. Really wonderful to talk to you.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Jenni Olson. It was a total honor and pleasure to speak with her. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and I cannot recommend seeking her films out enough. You can find them on the Criterion channel. If you're not a subscriber there, check them out on Mubi or Tubi.com. They're called The Joy of Life and The Royal Road, and her work is, again, very much worth thinking about. So thanks, Jenni Olson. Thank you, Nostalgia Trap listeners and subscribers. If you have somehow not subscribed to Nostalgia Trap yet, you can rectify that serious error at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and get access to all our bonus episodes, etc. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.